You were just, hold on, that just stuttered on me a little bit, so the audio went a little crazy. What am I
Just
saying?
say, this is David Daley, and you're watching the Break It Down show. Did you get that?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is
Do it.
David Daley, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
It's amazing that we can do all these things that we can, a little bit of internet stuff and everything else, sit across whatever you're at, wherever I'm at. I'm in Orange County, California. And, even with a little bit of a stutter in our Wi-Fi and everything else, it's neat to be able to talk to you, man. And you and I have sat on the same show a number of times. We're going to talk about your book today. I'm excited to talk to you, man. I dig it.
We're going to have fun. I'm looking forward to this a lot.
It does seem like we have a bit of a delay. So I don't know how we fix that. So I guess we'll just play with the delay. Make it all right.
I am not hearing you well at all here. I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi.
Let's see what I can do about that. Got to fix things live sometimes.
Okay, well, it's telling me I've got 3 bars. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Either way, we're going to talk about your book, Antidemocratic. You've written a number of books about how our democracy is being eroded away by a variety of techniques and purposes. This one focuses on the Republicans. Look, when we think about voting, we think about the president, and then we stop thinking about everybody else, right? But there are so many areas where there's competition, right? The census is a competition.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, I think that we sometimes look at the top of the ticket and we forget about everything underneath, and everything underneath is almost more important. And if there's a theme to the books that I have written, starting with right after about redistricting and gerrymandering, and now on to Antidemocratic about the courts, it is that there's these pressure points in our democracy that oftentimes are little known, but that if you can understand how to work them and how to manipulate them, because fewer people are watching, and because it's less expensive and easier to control these sort of tinier pressure points in the system, you can have a huge outsized influence. And I think one of the themes of this book is the way that when you can control state legislatures through redistricting, and when you can control the courts like Republicans have really figured out how to do over the last few decades, you can win a lot of things that you might never be able to win otherwise through a normal political process.
I was reading your book. That's great. Antidemocratic. In the 5th paragraph, before the book actually even starts, right? You talk about how we are a representative democracy. And I'm like, oh man, already we've got people that are going to be like, no, we're not. We're this, we're that, we're this, right? And then I'm like, well, let me look and see in general, like what are the answers that are out there? And, what's democracy versus republic? Etymologically, they're the same thing. But practically, right? What are we? Are we a representative democracy or are we not? Are we a republic? So already in the jump, like this becomes a challenging discussion.
Yes, but it's a challenging discussion because we're polarized, right?
Yeah.
In reality, as you just said, the actual etymology of we're a democracy or we're a republic, it's this gotcha between left and right sometimes. Yeah. But if you dig back and look at the etymology of the words as you did, they're basically the same thing. So I think when somebody says, are we a democracy or are we a republic? The right answer is
yes.
Yes. And, to me, the question is, what kind of a nation do we want to live in? And the people who say we're a democracy or the people who say we're a republic, one thing that both of us might agree on is Abraham Lincoln. And what Abraham Lincoln said in his first inaugural is that if we surrender control on the most important issues of the day to the Supreme Court, and I paraphrase that part, but at the end here is a direct quote, we will cease to become our own rulers. And what I think the "we're a democracy" or "we're a republic" crowd can agree on is that we, the people, should be our own rulers. And what we have right now is an unelected Supreme Court that has been appointed for life. 5 of the 6 of them appointed for life by presidents who lost the popular vote, who meet in private, who are basically essentially unaccountable to the people. They have no ethics standards or guidelines, and they're able to make basically decisions that guide the future of the country, whether we're talking about voting rights or guns or the regulatory state. With the new major questions doctrine, they can pretty much insert themselves into anything that they want. And the founders, in their wisdom, created a system of checks and balances of 3 co-equal branches. And what this unelected branch has done over the course of the last couple of decades is really assert itself and put itself above those other branches. And when the unelected branch puts itself above the elected branches, the people have ceased to become their own rulers, and we ought to be taking that really seriously.
I've had a couple of people who specialize in the Supreme Court, so I've read a few books about it, and there is a lot of how does this thing work, right? And different times, different leans, different ideas. Should they be legislating from the bench? And then you get the guy that goes, "Of course, we know the law," and then sometimes they apply the law not in a way to legislate, but to clarify legislation. And I don't remember which one it is, but within the last few years, there was one where I would say the left was hand wringing and the right was like, "Oh, it's going to go our way." But it went the other way, and it was the application of modern sexual orientation standards to a law from the 60s. And it went towards, hey, that law is going to apply. Like, you don't get to mess with people because of how their sexual orientation appears. And so we have these things where sometimes the court will flip on us and we look around and we're like, oh, that one went my way. And so we get a little desperate with how the court is going to behave. It tends to give us more of what we want over time, is my perception, but you're going to probably tell me something different or challenge that. But I guess, how do we sort out the court when it does fight with itself on, do they legislate? And let me just add this little piece in too. And nothing in this that I'm saying is meant to be critical of any of the justices. There's different ways to do this. If you read a Thomas decision, whether we dissent or whatever it's going to be, it's case law, case law, case law, case law. It's very rich in case law. If you read Justice Jackson's, it's very much about how the law ought to work and the things that it's supposed to do. And it's much more theoretic, I guess is probably the best way to say it. And I'm not saying anything wrong with either approach, but there's completely different approaches on the court. And you think, gosh, how do they sort these things out?
It's a great question, right? I mean, I would say in some ways that the Constitution and case law a lot is kind of like the Bible in a lot of ways. You can look at it and you can find almost anything you want to justify what it is you want to get out of it. Yeah. And I think that that's what we need to demystify, because when the law changes based on who the justices are, when somebody leaves the court and somebody else comes on, it blows up the idea, right, that the law is some sort of fixed thing that has any meaning at all. And it suggests that maybe this is less a court than it is a legislature. My sense is that whether or not we like the decisions that this court issues, that no 9 people in a democracy or a republic or a representative democracy ought to have this kind of lifetime veto-proof, unaccountable power. Because when they do, the people cease to be their own rulers. And that the question is less how the individual justices make their decisions than should any 9 people be entrusted with that kind of power. Especially, I would suggest, a court that has become as corrupted in many ways as this one. has, with no ethics standards. I would really like to know if there are 9 people who believe themselves to be so pure and true and wise that they can make these decisions on the most important issues of the day for all of
Yeah.
us, and essentially supplant the other 2 branches of government. I would like to know who's paying their kids' tuition and sending them on luxury vacations around the world and buying their family's property. I'd especially like to know if those people have interests before the court, because that's kind of sickening, and it would be sickening. I'm not picking on any individual justice here either. I
Yeah.
think it would. I think if we were to take all names and ideologies out of this and say, is this okay? We would agree that it's not. And indeed, when you look at polls, and if you look at a Fox News poll that says, should the Supreme Court have term limits, 78% say yes.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a deep concern on behalf of all Americans when you give people, I mean, it's Will Rogers, right? It's absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't want to take us too far from the theme of the book, but I think we're sort of right over the top of it in so many ways. I I wouldn't even say I'm enfranchised at all. Yes, I'm allowed to vote, but I don't have a voice federally whatsoever. And whether I vote Republican, I frankly don't care for any of the options in front of me. And I don't think that'll. Look, let me say it this way. This is, I think, very fair. Today, the candidates, because who knows what twists and turns are coming. Today, the candidates for president, most of the nation wants neither of them. And they're not polling well at all. And so you have a rejection. And so one of them is going to have to run Reform, who was beaten by Reform. And the other one is trying to figure out what they're going to, and it's like, it's crazy. And then we're talking about democracy. And I'm like, well, who even, and it just becomes patently ridiculous,
Yeah.
So
No,
sure,
I haven't seen a lot of polls since the Democrats made their switch. But certainly before that, what you had were the 2 most unpopular major party candidates probably in the history of modern opinion polling. And you had a nation that was really dreading the rematch that we were being forced into.
Yeah. And I'll be a little bit hard on the Democrats right now. The talking about democracy and everything else, where was the primary season for this candidate? They didn't even have the convention, and they've already decided who it is, and that just seems like anointment, not democracy. And so we're talking about that. Then we go to the House and Senate. Who's not getting fabulously wealthy over there? And so we talk about ethics. Oh my gosh, and term limits.
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not going to defend corruptibility by any stretch.
Right.
I would simply say that the House and the Senate have got decent ethics standards. And if you applied the same ethics standards to the U.S. Supreme Court, I'd be just fine with that.
Yeah.
And term limits, I mean, I'm not convinced that term limits work in Congress the way that people think that they might, but I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea. But at least there's elections every 2 years and every 6 years. I think there's a difference between, when you give somebody a lifetime appointment, saying, okay, it's an 18-year appointment, seems to me to be fair. For many years, the average appointment to the court was about 15 years. And these days it's stretched up closer to about 30. People are staying on for their entire life. And there's no other modern democracy around the world in which this is the case. And if we were to design a system right now, it wouldn't be the case where we handed this kind of absolute power with, no corruption guidelines, and awarded it forever. I mean, it's deeply disconcerting.
It is, and so I had a gotta make sure get his name right. I had a guy on my show who kind of specializes in the Supreme Court,
Hmm.
and was talking about it. The other thing is all of these Supreme Court people, regardless of political lean, are the same people. They clerk for the same people. They all have the same names on the tops of their degrees. And his point is, hey, why don't we get some people who ride circuit court, who have done other kinds of law? How about some business owners, And if we are going to expand the court, he and I both talked about this. Who has the trust to his name is Richard C. Lyons. And so who has the trust to do that? So I'm all for updating what we do. And I would even say expanding the size of the court, maybe not the number of judges, but a rotating bench. But
Rotating
I
bench
don't
is a
trust,
wonderful idea. I mean, if
I don't trust any of the fuckers in charge
right.
to be, haven't earned, at least my trust, that whichever person is up there is going to pull levers in a way that aren't strictly beneficial to their parties. I don't want a party. I want a judge who represents people and knows the law,
I don't think that's asking too much, right? And if we were to come up with some system of reforms, the lower federal courts, I think, work better in this regard. A case comes up and it gets assigned to a random panel.
Right.
And those judges have to work together to come to a decision. That seems like a better approach than dropping it in front of 9 kings, whom we all have a pretty good sense of what the turnout and the end results can
Right.
be.
Yeah. And, a lot of the system works good enough, right? And if we can improve it by 5% over the next 20 years, it would work even better. But there are these problems where you do see these things. Like, I'm not comfortable with the court swinging completely like the way it has in the last 5 years. That seems to be a little bit too extreme. I don't mind it being right for a while because the left can take that. And that's fine. But I'm a middle guy. Let's just figure out how to get along, right?
Yeah. And some of the stories I try to tell in this book are about how when you change the judges, you change the law, and how conservatives in this case have worked to change the law by changing the judges. So when the McCain-Feingold campaign finance package is passed 25 years ago or so, it's immediately taken to court and tested. And the Supreme Court in McConnell versus FEC upholds the vast majority of what was there, because Congress passed it overwhelmingly and had a good reason to want to try to control the amount of funds that are being spent to influence our politics and to help control how that is done, and to have rules around it, because I would think we would all want to know where that money is coming from. And as soon as the court changes, 2005-ish, you have Sandra Day O'Connor retires and Bill Rehnquist dies, and you get two new justices, and these are 2 new conservative justices replacing 2 conservative justices, but they're of a different stripe. And when Alito and Roberts come on the court, conservatives trying to undo this law try again just a couple of years later, right? So McConnell versus FEC is like 2003, and then by 2006 or so, you've got the Wisconsin right to life case, which is essentially going at that decision and that precedent, which has, the ink has barely dried on it. And indeed, what happens in that decision is it's the first chip at the log that ends up leading to the Citizens United case that overwhelms that precedent. And it's only been a couple of years. And so if the law changes when the court changes, what is the law?
Yeah, right.
Is this a court? I think you can look at this and say, maybe this isn't a court at all if the law changes in such a brief period of time based on who is on it. It seems much more like a tribunal.
I know this isn't a direct thing, but there are things that impact the court that we just don't realize. Look, you're a Daley, I'm a Turner. If we go to court, by the time I get there, lawyers, interpreters, A's, back to the lawyers, back to the interpreters, back to the alphabet. By the time we get there, it's after lunch, and the judge has had it. I've seen this happen. And so even things like that, where just the workflow is so furious, there's no time for empathy anymore. It's like, I just judge you this, I just judge you that. And so there is something to be said also for the amount of work we put through the legal system. And there is so much lawfare on both sides where everything is contested. Look, we have rights. You get to go to court, right? And so this is part of the thing. And so I'll make a case. Look, let me be hard on Alabama, and they lean right. So we'll be hard on the Republicans here. You open with a story about how gerrymandering impacts the court. And this is, I've got friends and stuff out there. So I've been out there and I've done shows, and I want to do a bunch of shows. And I'm always looking all around, right? Where am I going to do the show? So obviously we go to the Troy University, their museum that's right there at the bus stop where Rosa Parks has the whole thing, and it cracks off that part of the civil rights movement. And of course you have to talk to the person that runs that museum. And I'm like, all right, how do I balance this? And I look at the Jefferson Davis Museum, and they're celebrating his birthday and cutting a cake, and that's their big social media thing. And I'm like, I can't do that. I understand you have to hold that history and let's understand it. But you're celebrating the man's birthday, and I couldn't, in good faith, go and sit in front of these people because I didn't know how I would handle that. And I like to challenge myself, but that was too much of a challenge for me. So
yeah, celebrating a traitor goes a little too far.
And
yet, no, I mean, I was in Alabama, and I start the book in Calera, Alabama, which is probably not a town a lot of people know, but Calera is central to what I think is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in modern history, the Shelby County versus Holder case that essentially eviscerated the chief enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. And I would suggest that the Voting Rights Act is the most important civil rights legislation that the nation has ever had, and probably the most successful civil rights legislation. And it included this provision called preclearance, which was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It said that the places like Alabama that had a history of the most egregious racial discrimination in their voting laws, if they wanted to change their voting laws, they had to either go to the Department of Justice and get approval first, or take it to a court in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And there was a really good reason why Congress required this in the Voting Rights Act. And it was because these states and these localities had engaged in what had been called ingenious defiance of the Constitution for 100 years. The Reconstruction Amendments that ended the Civil War and gave blacks the vote, created equal protection under the law, ended slavery. A series of decisions by the Supreme Court in the 1870s effectively ended federal oversight, and it unleashed these states to do their worst for the next almost 100 years. And they did, right? From violence and murders and lynchings through poll taxes and white primaries and literacy tests and the entire other battery of things that happened. So preclearance was designed to say, hey, you're not going to be allowed to get away with ingenious defiance of the law anymore. And in 2006, when Congress reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act, and it's a Republican Congress and it's a Republican president, and it's pretty much unanimous. It's 390 to 33 in the House. It's 98 to nothing in the Senate. George W. Bush signs it in a bright sunny day outside the White House. Congress produces a 16,000-page document from 21 hearings around the country that says things are better. Sure, it's not 1965 anymore, but we still need pre-clearance because there's still all this stuff happening and people are trying to get away with things. There were elections that were just canceled. There's polling places that move and nobody tells you. And without pre-clearance, there is no way to get around this. And Calera finally elects its first Black counselor. And what happens? They immediately decide that they're going to redistrict. And the Black counselor in Calera's district goes from being a 70-30 Black district to a 70-30 white district, essentially overnight. Except Calera did not pre-clear the changes to the map. And so the Department of Justice says you can't hold this election. Shelby County eventually uses this to file suit against preclearance and to say that preclearance ought to be unconstitutional. This is the best example of why we need it, right? Because this town is still in 2006, 2007, they're still trying to get away with things while violating the law. The idea that Calera is an example of how things have changed for the better and why we don't need this is just absurd. And yet that's what the U.S. Supreme Court decides in Shelby County, that things have changed. We don't need this anymore. And the second that the Supreme Court makes that decision, it sets off a cavalcade of laws across all of these states. Preclearance had been the prison guard. And once the prison guard was taken away, all of the dark forces that were just in there waiting to come back out, they rushed out, they were unleashed on our politics, and we've seen the consequence.
I mean, we sure as heck have seen it with anti-Semitism, right? People are waving their anti-Semitism flag, and you're like, what the fuck? I thought we were done with this thing.
What happened?
And it's akin, like where we see these things that we thought were evils that we had kind of beat, and we haven't beat them. No. I wanted to ask you about one of the things. So along the way, I met a lot of people, and a number of these people are lawyers or judges or whatever, and they sit in a position where they sit on like the election, and they don't control it, but they're there to oversee and make sure it's fair. And they're like, Pete, you have no idea how I'm adding the word individually crazy all of these different places are. And so like the law is still struggling to make something that, and I'm just this is an obvious statement. A lot of us, whoever loses, they're going to be like, we was robbed. And there'll be tens of millions of people that will believe that, and you'll never convince them otherwise, right? And we hear it all the time, so-and-so lost because of this, so-and-so lost because of that, and so there's all of this around us. Can we even can we put that horse back in the barn, or has that barn been flattened and gentrified and now there's a walkable working space above it or something?
If you ask a great question, right? I mean, how are we united once again when we're this divided and this polarized? And that's a big question, and I think it goes beyond our politics, right? I mean, it goes to where we get our news and who we talk to and who we listen to and where we live, and whether we spend any time at all engaging in learning about the good faith arguments on the other side, and trying to work things out together. And I'm not sure that the faith or the trust is there. I think it's and I think that the structural problems in our politics are some of the things we have to take on if we want to try to fix it. I mean, gerrymandering and redistricting, it's really, really bad when politicians draw their own districts and choose their own voters. But we say that, but like sometimes we don't get into why it's so bad, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's so bad because when you create really uncompetitive districts that which side is going to win in the fall, the only race that matters is the party primary. And not that many people vote in the party primary. Turnout's 15, 16% because it's held in June when nobody's around or thinking about politics, or July.
Yeah.
And when that's the important race, you might have 9 different people running in it, right? So somebody can win that race and then essentially walk into office by winning 15, 16% of the vote in an election that nobody takes part in. There are members of Congress right now that owe their seats to party primaries that they've won with somewhere between 20 and 35% of the vote. And so they don't have to listen to everybody. They don't care. All they care about is keeping that little base that they got elected with agitated and outraged, and happy with them, because the only way that they can lose is by losing that base, or by somebody else coming along and pissing that base off more. So we have to think about how we elect people, about ranked choice voting and primaries, about more competitive districts, about all of these things fit together if we want a different kind of politics. If we want different kinds of people in office who are incentivized to reach out and work across the aisle, we have to elect them in a different way.
Boy, just said a lot right there, and I appreciate it. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, my stance right now is, at least at the top of the ticket, vote out all incumbents, because it's the only thing I can do, because I can't in good conscience vote for most of the people that I see in front of me, right? And I want change, and so change means not what's there. And I totally agree. I don't care what party they're from. I just want someone to look. We're always told to write your congressional member. Go ahead and do that. Let me know when they get back to you.
Right.
If you put $5,000 in that envelope, I'm not lying, you will get a meeting. And so that's a problem. That's not a representative democracy. That's not a republic. That's not any. That's an oligarchy. I mean, that's not what we want, right? But that's what we have. And so if the power does reside with us, if we are a republic or a democracy at their etymological root, we should be able to get term limits if we want them. We should be able to change the court if we want to, instead of it being party driven. But I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering if I don't want to say I'm apathetic, but whatever is 2 notches before apathetic, that's where I'm at. And I know a lot of people are like that.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to maintain our optimism and our faith in the system when there's this many issues and we feel this powerless to do anything about it. And that is also a sign of small d democratic decay.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about a lot of legal cases. And the book is, look, I'm not telling everybody, it's a challenging book. If you want to prove that you're smart and everything, you got to read this thing so you can get through it. And you're going to have to a
page turner too, slow. Though, and I mean, there's some storytelling in there.
No, it's wonderful. And I don't want to give the impression that, but you're going to have to work and earn it. And there's tons of references. And so, Nate Silver is referenced in this, right? Like, these are common names, but other things and other cases that you reference, I had one of them that I want to talk to you about. Brnovich, right? Brnovich case. And so, I'm the kind of guy, I'm like, I tend to read some Supreme Court decisions because that's what I think I need to do. And so I didn't know that one. And so guess what I did for the next 2 hours?
Oh yeah.
I start reading through, right? And so that's what your book inspires in me, is how do I really understand what you're saying and try to, and look, I respect what you do too. Like, I wouldn't spend that much time if I didn't appreciate what you put into the book, and you're putting in the book what you can get into the book. There's probably so much more we could talk about.
This could be 3 books trying to tell this story. Brnovich is a fascinating case. It's out of Arizona. And what's interesting about it, right, is in the Shelby County case, the Supreme Court says, and this is, 2013. The Supreme Court says, well, we think things have changed in the South and that we don't need preclearance anymore. And I think this was a case that was decided on phony statistics, and that the Chief Justice essentially made up the law and ignored Congress. But regardless of which, regardless of that, how did you like the play, Mrs. Lincoln, right? But something else that the Chief Justice says in that case is we don't need Section 5 because we also have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that applies to the entire country. And it's harder to use because Section 5 stopped something before it was enacted, and Section 2 you have to sue and wait so it goes into effect. But Section 2 is still there. And then, of course, predictably, the court begins whittling back Section 2. And Brnovich is just a few years later. And Arizona had been one of the states that had been required to do preclearance in the past. And the second that they were freed from preclearance, they went back and they enacted all of the laws that they had not been allowed to do previously. Yeah. And some of these laws had to do with out-of-precinct voting and what gets called ballot harvesting. And what I want people to do is to drop their partisan blinders for a second around the idea of out-of-precinct.
No.
Because I think that it's really easy to say, well, you went to the wrong precinct, so of course your vote shouldn't count. Why do you think your vote should count? You showed up in the wrong place, idiot.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to show up in the same place? Well, let me tell you why it's so hard to show up in the right place. Because the state of Arizona continuously changes the polling place in neighborhoods filled with the most Latino, Black, and Native American voters. Right. And the academic research on this is incontrovertible. It's sometimes every single election, these polling places move. So the place where you went to vote last time is not the place where you are going this time. And in the white neighborhoods, this just doesn't happen. So when you can intentionally show, and I'm not even getting into intent. Are they doing it intentionally? Maybe not. I think they probably are. But so this is a problem, and it's disproportionate, and it has a racial impact. And this is the kind of thing that the Voting Rights Act would have prevented in the past. Now these laws were enacted. And people went to the court and said, well, then they're a violation of Section 2. And Alito said, no, they're not. And they whittled back Section 2, and the court effectively rewrote the statute, rolled it back to where it had been 40 years earlier. And we think about the court as just interpreting the law, and you can't argue with a judge doing his or her job interpreting the law. But it's not even that they're legislating from the bench. It's that sometimes they are making up the law and rewriting the law. These are emperors who have no clothes.
Yeah.
And again, it's like, I don't care if it's a liberal justice doing this or a conservative justice doing this. None of them should be doing this. If your job is to interpret the law, your job is not to rewrite these standards. The people's elected representatives wrote this. You don't get to rewrite it. And I don't care if you're Justice Jackson or Justice Alito. It doesn't fly. It's not okay.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. And we have the other issue. The other day we had a guy, Dr. Ambassador Robert Hunter on, and Robert's got decades and decades, worked with the Johnson administration and every administration that would have him after that, which is basically all of them. And he talks about the legislature's unwillingness to do their job and to allow the executive branch to set things. And then the executive branch is competing with the Supremes, and they're trying to decide what they can and can't do. And then, Jackson comes in from the grave, is like, they have to be able to enforce it. And so the boss does what the boss wants to do. Meanwhile, Congress is like, hey, I'm not saying they're lazy, but they're not doing their job. They're allowing these other checks to sort of run amok. And so we have this problem as well as, the Supremes will kick it back over to the Congress and say, hey, abortion is going to be on the states. You guys are going to have to figure this out. It's not going to be a federal thing for right now. come back to us if you change your minds. Okay. And look, a lot of us may not like that, but it is an element of freedom to have the states decide these things. If Congress would have done their job 50 years ago and written federal legislation and got it through the House at some point, and then Congress or Senate or whatever, whichever direction you want it to go, we wouldn't have this problem. But they didn't do it. And so we have this legislation problem where they won't declare war. They write more and more checks. They make these crazy, well, you know this, but they make these multi-foot tall bills that you have to not be able to read, and they're complicated reading, to make things happen, to make the government work. And gosh, man, I just think all of this stuff just goes into your big pile of things saying, where's my representation? And both sides do it. Sometimes both sides collaborate together to do it. And they come up with these deals that don't make anybody happy on the other end of it.
You know, one of the themes of this book as well is the way that partisan gerrymandering and control of the courts kind of fold together, and how that works, and how both of these have been used to really take power away from the people and to hand it over to sort of an entrenched minority rule. And I think that the Dobbs decision is in many ways a really good example of this, because what Justice Alito writes in his decision is, we're not taking away a right or overturning anything. We're returning a divisive, contentious issue to the people and their elected representatives. And the problem with that is that these states and these state legislatures have been so wildly gerrymandered, and the Supreme Court has allowed these gerrymanders to exist and continue. Indeed, they've accelerated them and maximized them, so that you can't actually have decisions in these states that represent the will of the people. I use as an example here the state of Wisconsin, where after the court's decision came down, a law from 1847 banning abortion went back onto the books in the state of Wisconsin. Maybe we shouldn't be governed on a modern issue based on a law from 1847. That's, neither here nor there in some ways. So it closed down every clinic in Wisconsin, and the governor said, "Well, I'm going to call the legislature back in to do something about this, and we're going to have a debate. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to figure out a way forward." Right. Yeah. You've got a Marquette poll in the state of Wisconsin that shows that 70% of people want these rights to continue. The gerrymandered legislature in the state of Wisconsin gavelled in and gavelled out of that special session in less than a minute. They wouldn't even hold the conversation.
Wow.
So was this return to the people and their elected representatives in Wisconsin? It was not. The kinds of laws and restrictions that passed in Texas and Oklahoma, in Alabama, in Ohio, in Florida, and these are red states, were passed without popular support in any of those states, but the legislatures went ahead and did them anyway. So when you return something to the people and their elected representatives, but the people are powerless to actually have any influence over their elected representatives, and those elected representatives feel like they can go off and do whatever the hell they want because they're immune from the ballot box, that is, it's disingenuous on behalf of the court, which knows this. These are not dumb people. It's further example of what Lincoln said, right? We cease to be our own rulers when this happens.
Yeah. I'm always big on, and this is just a Pete soapbox thing, but people are so desperate for everybody else to vote, but they're not desperate themselves to go sit on a jury. And what's more immediate and direct than sitting and judging each other? I mean, that's as close to freedom as you get. And we don't have the same kind of campaign for that, right? And so we do have these conflicting messages that involve electing somebody else who doesn't know me, isn't going to know me. I could try to communicate with them and they'll never communicate back with me. I'm going to try to communicate with my state senator, state representative in the next couple of weeks. And if I don't get a message back, guess what? I mean an actual message, not a robot. If I don't get a message back, they're going on the vote out all incumbents box,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just how I'm going to approach these things, because I'm not going to sit around and let the status quo be the status quo.
Right.
You have this, I want to talk about General Meese. You had this brilliant little section about that. So that's my setup, and I'm going to let you run with it.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, what's amazing is you can pick up the phone and just call him, and he calls you back. Which is pretty wild. I put his name in my phone, and I was out for a run, and I'm just running, and I look down, and it lights up Edwin Meese. I'm like, oh, I guess I'll stop and catch my breath and answer the phone. Hello, sir.
Yeah.
But Meese is a fascinating figure. He's Ronald Reagan's right-hand man as governor of California. He plays an important role in his first term over in the White House and moves over to DOJ as Attorney General in the second term. And Meese is a brilliant tactician and strategist on top of everything else that he did politically and strategically for Reagan over the course of his career. And Meese recognizes a couple of things. Meese gets to Washington, and he wants to see a change in the law, and things to be pushed in more of his direction. And he realizes he lacks good judges to appoint, because there's just not a big conservative bench for him to go to. Mm-hmm. And whenever he does try to appoint somebody, they've got something in their past, or they've been too clear on issues, and they run into trouble in Congress, and they end up getting voted down. So both of these things are frustrating him. He comes up with a couple of really good solutions. The first one is to work very closely with a new young organization that had just started out, which is now well known to us all, the Federalist Society. And he begins to fill DOJ with these bright young conservatives coming out of the Federalist Society, and he gives them jobs and responsibility. And it becomes really clear to young conservatives and young Republicans that the Federalist Society is a path. And if you want to succeed in conservative politics and the conservative legal movement, you need to be a member of this group. And if you are, you will have access to this kind of career path and these kinds of people. And Meese goes and he talks at every college chapter. He goes to the lunches at Chinese restaurants every Monday. Shows up, he puts in the work, he does the FaceTime, and he helps build the Federalist Society in the 1980s, so that the organization that it is today, as the real credentialing society for the conservative legal movement, might not happen otherwise. The other thing Meese does is he leans into what's known as originalism. And originalism at that point was essentially just an academic theory.
Right.
And what Meese recognizes is that, like all academic theories, no one really knows what it means, but that if you can define it, you can give judges a new way of talking about things. So all of a sudden, the conservative judges who are nominated in the 1980s are not talking about how they want to overturn a Roe versus Wade, or how they want to, they're not talking about the unitary executive theory or the major questions doctrine. They're talking about how, well, I believe that you ought to reach decisions on today based on the original intent and meaning of the Constitution. And that's hard to disagree with, right? That sounds neutral. It sounds easy. You can say that on talk radio and it makes perfect sense. And people nod along in their cars.
I was kind of believing you there myself.
Right? Except that what it actually was it was sort of a Trojan horse, right? It was kind of a Trojan horse because it was this new way to frame and talk about things that really helped lead to more conservative victories and conservative judges that might not have happened otherwise. And so the rise of originalism as a constitutional theory, the rise of conservative outcomes looking like common sense is very much a legacy of Mies, as is the role and influence of the Federalist Society.
Yeah, it's funny. Rolling Stone will rate the top 100 albums of all time, and you're forced to talk about it because they establish the conversation, right? And the originalist conversation is a similar kind of thing, and then you get not stuck with it, but it becomes a validated theory. You can ask people about all kinds of theories, and they'll tell you what the answer is, whether or not the theory's been proven or not. It's a thing that humans do. We latch on to what we like, and we like originalism. A lot of us. If we, I don't want to complain anymore, so I want to look forward. By the way, everybody should buy this Antidemocratic. It's just now out. Is it out officially now today?
It is. Came out Tuesday.
Yeah. You should get it. It's awesome. It's a challenging read because you have to use your brain, and I think you guys can do that. And I always say, buddy, read it, buy two. And the link is down below. I'm going to put it in there right now.
Thank you.
The link. It's in the remarks. You guys can type it into the dang internet. You know how to do this stuff.
My name's not that hard to spell.
Yeah, it's not that hard. And I bring David back on because we can have these conversations that are reasonable, that's rational. We can we're not thumping a drum for one team. We're trying to thump a drum for all of us. So we all have franchise and we all have things to do. But I would submit to you that simply going to the ballot box is not going to fix the problems that you've laid out here. Simply voting for a party is not going to fix the problems that you have outlaid here. So if you can encourage people to do something, or some things, what would you encourage them to do? And then maybe follow that up with, if you got anointed like somebody else and you were all of a sudden going to be the president, what one thing would you change about the process, even though it would be to your detriment possibly to do it, but to improve the things you outlined in all of your books, really, frankly?
Well, let me say first that I'm uncomfortable with one person having that much power, as I said earlier. So I should not have that much power. But if you want to give it to me,
just for funsies.
I think there's a lot of problems we have to take on. There's a lot of structural fixes that we need to think about to make our democracy better. Let me throw this one out that people don't think about very often. By 2035, it's been said 70% of us are going to live in 15 states, which means 70% of the country is going to have 30% of the Senate, and the other 30% of the country is going to have 70% of the Senate. And that's not a exact partisan breakdown, right? Because some of those small states are Vermont and some of them are Wyoming. Some of them are blue, some of them are red. But shouldn't we probably agree that we need to find a way to look at the Senate so that it actually works and functions again? Because it was set up with 13 states and it was set up with it was set up for a reason, but over time that has changed, and the gulf in population in the states has changed, and it's only going to amplify and get worse. And if we don't think about how we fix it, we're not going to be able to come to any solutions on just about anything. I think that the Supreme Court, this court is going to be there probably into the 2050s. I have an 11-year-old if Justice Barrett stays on the court for as long as Justice Ginsburg, my 11-year-old will be almost 60. And that's a long time. It was a long time for Justice Ginsburg. It's a long time for Justice Barrett. Can we agree that perhaps there ought to be some kind of a term limit there? Every president gets 2 picks. You elect the president, you end up picking 2 justices. We can do away with all of these contentious, polarizing fights. You win, you're going to get 2. That's the way it is, and it's not going to be relying on actuarial tables or someone dying or anything else. But I also think we have to think about how we elect the House, because I think districting and that kind of gerrymandering is just reprehensible, and it doesn't represent us. So finding a new way to sort of think about that, and I think that there's lots of ways to do it. I think the best way would involve multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, to the extent that I mean, I'm in Massachusetts, and there's 9 members of the U.S. House from Massachusetts, and all of them are Democrats. But all of the people here are not Democrats, so it shouldn't be a 9-0 delegation, right?
Right.
If the state is 61-39, why can't we figure out a way that 60% of the delegation is Democratic and 40% of it is Republican? And you could, if you used the multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, you would get a delegation that's more proportional. And so you'd have 6 Democrats and 3 Republicans from Massachusetts, and maybe you'd have it be the other way in Tennessee instead of 8-1. And boy, don't you think that if there were some Massachusetts Republicans and some Tennessee Democrats who had to sort of go to Washington and get along and talk to one another, that maybe there'd be some bridge builders again in the middle who might be able to have some conversation? I mean, I think that would be a huge help. So thinking about these things as far as the structure has been weaponized against us. And we have to find a way to think about how we fix this structure so that it represents us again. And that's the challenge that's on all of us as Americans, as citizens who want this to work.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. The Senate thing is interesting. If Pete had the ability to send you a letter, be like, hey, any Congress member who reaches an accrued wealth of $100 million, $50 million, whatever the number is, hey, congratulations, you've won. We're going to go to your district, and all registered voters are going to go into a big bubble. We're going to spin them around, and then out comes one. Pete Turner, do you want the job? No. Ding, ding, ding. Ping pong ball goes bouncing. David Daley, do you want the job? Yes. There's your representative until a special election can happen. What's that?
Me, yes.
Yeah. There are 20 million-ish Democrats in California, and there are 20 million-ish non-that in California, right? And it's the representation problem is real. There's an entire enclave, and by enclave, I mean the northern part of Northern California, that's like, get us the fuck out of here.
Right. And you've got as many senators as the state of Wyoming. So you're not really very well represented at all. And it's a problem. And there are ways to fix it. And there are ways to fix it that are fair, and that it's kind of like a jury. I mean, you mentioned a jury system before, and I was kind of nodding along thinking that the thing about a jury that works is that 12 people get put in a room and they have to weigh some evidence and come to a conclusion together, and they all have to agree. Yeah. Like, there's nothing in our politics like that at all.
Right. Yeah.
It can be done. Yeah. People of good faith can learn all that is to be learned about something, and they can sit in a room together and figure it out. Regular Americans do this every single day, and yet our political system is unable to do it. So maybe what we have to do is find ways to encourage that kind of system.
Yeah. Listen, I hate to cut and run, but you and I both have things to do. This has really been awesome, and I want you to come back and talk more about this whole thing. And I love your ideas. So, anything in closing before I let you go? I know
Anytime,
you
my
got
friend.
stuff to do. What's that?
No, that's perfect. I need to run off and grab my kid, but thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. It's great to be able
You
to
were
come on and
awesome.
talk about these things in a fun way.
Thanks, man. Thanks, everybody.
Really
Hey,
appreciate it.
thanks for
Bye-bye.
watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching.